He walked away without looking back. The engine roared, dust rose into the air, and a pregnant woman stood frozen on a red village road, one hand on her belly, the other trembling with tears she could no longer wipe away. She had sold her last hope to save his life. She had given her blood so he could live. And now, with a single step onto a bus, he erased her, denied her child, and buried a promise made before God. The village watched, some whispered, some laughed, and she learned in that moment that loving the wrong man can cost you everything. But what happens when the past you abandoned refuses to stay buried, when success in the city is haunted by a child crying in a forgotten village, and when the tears you ignored become the very thing blocking your future? Before the story continues, tell us where you're watching from in your local time. And if stories of justice, pain, and redemption move you, subscribe and stay with us. The morning Daniel left the village, the sun rose without mercy. It climbed quickly into the sky, burning the red earth beneath Ruth's bare feet, as if even nature refused to soften what was about to happen. The narrow road that cut through the village was already busy women heading to the stream, children chasing one another, goats wandering freely. But to Ruth, the world had narrowed to one thing: only Daniel and the small bag at his feet. He stood taller than she remembered, wearing a crisp shirt that still smelled new. It was the same shirt she had bought for him months earlier after weeks of selling cassava and vegetables in the market. She had imagined him wearing it proudly beside her one day, maybe on their wedding day. Now it looked like a uniform for departure. "Daniel," she called softly, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. "Please, don't leave like this." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his bag and glanced down the road, impatient, as though the village itself were an obstacle delaying his real life. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were cold stranger's eyes, not the eyes of the man who once whispered her name in the dark. "I've told you already," he said flatly. "My life has changed." Ruth swallowed hard and stepped closer. Her belly, round and heavy with 8 months of pregnancy, pulled her balance forward. She steadied herself and searched his face for any trace of the man she loved. Changed how she asked. "Is it not the same life we planned together?" Daniel scoffed. "Planned?" He shook his head. "That was before. I'm going to the city now. I can't marry a village woman like you. Do you know what people will say about me?" The words landed like stones. Village woman, as if it were a disease. Ruth's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "I am pregnant," she whispered. "Our baby." Our Daniel laughed short and bitter. "Who told you it's mine?" The question sucked the air from her lungs. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Around them, the road grew quieter. A few villagers had slowed their steps. No one interfered, but everyone listened. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking now. "How can you say that? After everything, after all I did for you." He looked away again. "Don't start," he snapped. "I didn't ask you to do those things. I don't owe you my future." Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You were dying," she said quietly. "You couldn't stand, you couldn't eat, you called my name every night. You promised me that was then," he interrupted. "This is now." At the edge of the road, the bus conductor shouted, "Last passenger, we are going." Daniel's body tensed, ready to move. Ruth reached out and grabbed his arm. The moment her fingers touched his skin, he jerked away as if she had burned him. "Don't touch me," he said sharply. The rejection cut deeper than any slap. "Remember when you were nothing." Ruth pleaded, tears spilling freely now. "Remember when your friends disappeared. When even your family had no hope, I sold my goat for you. I gave my blood for you. I stayed when everyone else left." "I didn't force you," Daniel replied. His voice was firm, rehearsed, as if he had practiced this speech many times. "You chose to do those things. Now choose your own life and leave me alone. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. An elderly woman shook her head slowly. Another whispered, "Shameless." Someone else sighed. "This is how men change when small money touches them." Ruth heard none of it clearly. Her ears rang. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the child inside her could hear it. "Daniel," she said one last time, her voice breaking completely. "If not for me, think of this child. Don't abandon your own blood." He paused, one foot already on the bus step. For a second, just one Ruth thought she saw hesitation. Hope flared painfully in her chest. Then his face hardened. "Don't come and spoil my future," he said. With that, he climbed into the bus. The door slammed shut. Dust rose as the engine coughed to life. Ruth stumbled forward, but the bus was already moving, pulling away from the village, carrying Daniel with it, her Daniel, the man she loved, the man she had almost died for. She stood there as the bus disappeared around the bend, the red dust settling slowly on her wrapper, her feet her dreams. Around her, villagers stood in uneasy silence. "Ah," one woman murmured, clicking her tongue. "See how she suffered for him." "Now he has seen small city life," another replied. "He has forgotten the hand that lifted him." Ruth finally sank to her knees, her arms wrapped tightly around her belly, as if to shield the child from the cruelty of the world. Hot tears fell freely, soaking into the earth beneath her. "Don't worry, my child," she whispered through sobs. "Even if your father has forgotten us, I will not forget you. I will never leave you." Above her, the sun continued its journey across the sky, indifferent and bright. The road remained empty. The village slowly returned to its rhythm. But for Ruth, everything had changed. From that day, the village became a mirror that reflected her pain back at her. The laughter that once filled her compound was gone. Where Daniel's voice used to echo, there was now only the dull sound of pounding cassava and the quiet crying of a woman learning what it meant to be alone. Her parents were long gone, no husband, no protection. Just a leaking mud house and a growing belly that announced her shame to anyone who looked. That morning was not just the day Daniel left. It was the day Ruth's long suffering truly began. Long after the dust from the bus had settled, Ruth's body remained on that road, but her mind drifted backward, pulled into a past that refused to stay buried. It was a memory she did not invite yet. It came anyway, sharp and vivid like a wound touched without warning. 2 years earlier, before the betrayal, before the pregnancy, before the village learned to whisper her name with scorn, Daniel had been dying. It had started quietly. A fever that refused to break. Night sweats that soaked his mat. Shaking chills that rattled his bones even under the thick Harmattan heat. At first, people said it was nothing. "He will be fine," they told Ruth. "Young men are strong." But Daniel did not get better. Day after day, Ruth watched him grow thinner. His skin turning dull and yellow, his lips cracking with thirst. He lay on a thin mat in his father's hut, barely able to lift his head. Flies hovered around him, despite Ruth's constant waving. The smell of herbs filled the room. Roots crushed by local healers, bitter mixtures poured down his throat in hope rather than certainty. The church elders came to pray. Hands were laid, scriptures were shouted. Still, the fever stayed. One evening, as Daniel shivered violently, Ruth knelt beside him and pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching. "Ruth," he whispered weakly, "don't leave me." Her heart broke in silence. "We have to take him to the general hospital in town," she said later that night, her voice trembling but determined. "He will die if we don't." Daniel's mother burst into tears, with which money she cried. "Your parents are gone. My husband is sick too. We have nothing left." Ruth did not answer immediately. She walked outside into the night where the village slept under a thin moon. Her feet carried her toward the small brown goat tied near her cassava farm. It was the only thing she truly owned. She had raised it from a tiny kid, fed it scraps when food was scarce, talked to it when loneliness pressed too hard. That goat was her savings, her future bride price, her safety. She untied the rope with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the animal, tears sliding down her face. "But if I must choose, I will choose him." Before dawn, Ruth began the long walk to the next village where a wealthy livestock buyer lived. The road was rough and dark. Her worn slippers tore against stones. By the time she arrived, her feet were bleeding. The man looked at the goat, then at her swollen eyes. "Why are you selling at this hour?" he asked suspiciously. "My friend is sick," she replied simply. "Please buy it, even if you pay small." He paid less than half its worth. Ruth did not argue. With the money, and a little more borrowed from neighbors who pitied her desperation, she rushed Daniel to the hospital in town. There, she became his shadow. She slept on a hard bench beside his bed for days. She skipped meals so she could buy his drugs. When nurses scolded her for late payments, she bowed her head and apologized again and again, swallowing her pride so he could survive. One night, a doctor pulled her aside. His face was grave. "If we don't find blood for him," he said quietly, "he may not survive till morning." Ruth did not hesitate. "Take mine," she said. The nurse frowned. "You are small, are you sure?" Ruth nodded, her voice steady, despite the fear roaring inside her. "If he dies, what will I live for? They took her blood." The weakness came quickly. Dizziness blurred her vision. Her legs trembled beneath her. Still, she refused to leave Daniel's side. When the fever finally broke, when his breathing steadied and his eyes opened fully, Ruth felt like collapsing from relief. "Ruth," he whispered hoarsely. "Yes," she said, smiling through exhaustion. "I'm here." "You stayed." "I will always stay," she replied. "I will never leave you." That night, as the old ceiling fan hummed above them, Daniel reached for her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were full. "When I get better," he promised, "I will marry you. I swear before God and man." Ruth believed him. Now, sitting alone in her leaking mud house, pregnant and abandoned, Ruth pressed a hand against her chest as the memory faded. "He forgot," she whispered bitterly. "He forgot all of it, but the land had not forgotten. The earth beneath her feet had drunk her tears. The trees had heard her prayers. And in Igbo land, elders say the ground remembers every injustice poured into it." The next morning the sun rose, hot and unforgiving. Ruth tied her faded wrapper tighter around her waist and picked up her hoe. She was 8 months pregnant. Her back ached. Her legs felt weak. But hunger showed no mercy. She stood alone on her small farm, staring at the stubborn soil stretching before her like an enemy. If Daniel were still there, he would have helped her weed, teased her into laughter, carried the heavier loads. Now only her sweat answered her effort. The wind brushed her face gently like a mother's hand. She wiped away tears quickly. There was no time to cry. Slowly, painfully, she bent and dug into the earth. Her belly pulled heavily at her spine, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone. With every movement, pain shot through her body. Still, she continued. "Please stay strong," she whispered to the life inside her. "Your mother will not fail you." Hours later, under the burning sun, Ruth harvested what little cassava and vegetables she could manage. Her hands shook with exhaustion. Her back burned as if on fire. She balanced the load on her head and began the long walk to the market. The market buzzed with noise, laughter, shouting, bargaining voices rising and falling like waves. But when Ruth entered, the sound shifted. Women turned to look at her, their eyes sharp and judging. "There she is," one whispered loudly. "The girl who lifted a man and got dumped like old cloth." Another added with a bitter laugh, I heard she sold her last goat when he was sick. See how he paid her back." They pretended they weren't speaking to her. Everyone knew better. Ruth kept her eyes on the ground as she arranged her vegetables on a small mat. She felt their stares like needles on her skin. She bit her lip to keep from crying. By the end of the day, only a few items had sold. As she walked home slowly under the setting sun, her body aching and her heart heavier than her load, Ruth understood something clearly for the first time. The love that had almost killed her was gone, but the strength it had forced her to find would have to keep her alive. From the day Daniel disappeared down that red road, Ruth learned that loneliness could be louder than noise. The village did not chase her away. No one threw stones or shouted curses. Instead, they did something worse. They watched her. Every step she took reminded people of her condition. Her belly grew rounder by the week, stretching the faded wrapper she tied tightly around her waist. It announced her shame before she could open her mouth. In Umuai village, pregnancy without a husband was not just a private burden. It was public property. Ruth lived alone in a small mud house at the edge of the village. The roof leaked whenever rain fell, leaving damp patches on the floor and forcing her to place old bowls under the drips at night. The walls were cracked, the door hung loosely on one hinge, and the silence inside often pressed so hard on her chest that she struggled to breathe. Before, Daniel's laughter had filled that compound. Now, the only sounds were the thud of her pestle pounding cassava and the quiet sobs she tried to swallow before they escaped. At the village stream, women washed clothes side by side, their wrappers hitched up, their voices sharp with gossip. When Ruth approached, conversations paused for a heartbeat just long enough to notice her, and then resumed louder than before. See her Mama Favor would say, her voice carrying deliberately. She followed a man who had nothing. She fed him with her sweat. Another woman would respond, now small money has entered his hand and he has forgotten her like an old wrapper. They laughed, scrubbing their clothes harder. Ruth stood a little apart, washing her garments slowly, carefully. She kept her eyes on the water, watching ripples spread and disappear. Each word cut her, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. At night, she lay on her thin mat listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. Couples whispered. Babies cried. Somewhere, a man laughed with his wife. Ruth turned to her side and pressed a hand against her stomach. "You are not a curse," she whispered to the child inside her. "You are not a mistake." Still, doubt crept in when hunger gnawed at her ribs and the future stretched before her like an endless road with no shade. One morning, the sun was already high when Ruth picked up her hoe. She was 8 months pregnant. Her back felt stiff when she straightened and her legs trembled slightly beneath her weight. But food did not grow itself. She walked alone to her small farm, the path dusty beneath her feet. The land greeted her without pity. Weeds had grown stubbornly around the cassava stems and the soil felt hard-resistant. If Daniel were still there, she thought he would have joked as they worked. He would have teased her about moving too slowly, then taken the hoe from her hands when her back began to ache. Now there was only silence. Ruth bent down and began to weed. Each movement sent a dull pain through her spine. Sweat rolled down her temples, stinging her eyes. The sun burned her skin, but she did not stop. "If I rest, we don't eat," she murmured. "If I stop, you suffer." Her belly shifted heavy and firm. She paused briefly, breathing hard, and rested her hands on her knees. "Please stay strong," she whispered. "Your mother will not fail you." Hours passed. By the time she finished harvesting what little cassava and vegetables she could manage, her arms felt like they no longer belonged to her. Still, she balanced the load carefully on her head and began the long walk to the market. The market was alive with sound vendors shouting prices, children darting between stalls, the smell of pepper and palm oil thick in the air. But when Ruth arrived, the atmosphere changed. Eyes followed her. "There she is," someone said, not bothering to lower their voice. "The one who trapped a man and still lost him," another replied. Ruth sat on the ground and arranged her goods neatly on a small mat. She forced a smile for anyone who came close, but many passed by without stopping. A group of women walked past her stall and deliberately crossed to the other side. "Be careful," one of them said loudly. "If you buy from her, your husband may leave you too." Laughter followed. Ruth's fingers trembled as she straightened a bunch of vegetables. She felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed hard. Crying would not sell cassava. Later, a drunk man staggered through the market, his breath heavy with alcohol. He stopped in front of her, pointed at her belly, and laughed. "Look at her," he shouted. "She thought love would save her. Now she wants pity." The market went quiet. Ruth froze. Heat flooded her face. Shame burned through her veins like fire. Slowly, she lowered herself to the ground and covered her face with both hands. And for the first time since Daniel left, she cried openly, not silent tears, but broken sobs that shook her body. "I am not a bad person," she whispered between breaths. "I only loved the wrong man." Some people looked away uncomfortable, others shook their heads. A few still laughed. Ruth wiped her face, gathered her unsold goods, and stood up. Her heart ached, but something inside her hardened. "No matter what happens," she whispered to her unborn child, "I will not throw you away. I will carry you. And one day, the same mouths laughing today will bow their heads." That night, rain clouds gathered over Umwai village. Thunder rolled like distant drums, and the sky opened. Ruth's labor began with a sharp pain that stole her breath. Water dripped steadily through the holes in her roof as she groaned, clutching her stomach. Pain shot through her back deep and relentless. There was no husband to run for help, no mother to hold her hand. "God, please," she whispered, sweat soaking her wrapper. "Don't let me die here." With shaking legs, she staggered through the rain to the compound of Mama Grace, an elderly woman known for helping women give birth. When Ruth collapsed at her doorstep, Mama Grace dropped her broom in shock. "Chai," the old woman exclaimed, "your time has come." Labor was long and cruel. Ruth screamed until her voice broke. Rain beat hard against the zinc roof. Wind pushed through the cracks in the walls. "Push, my daughter," Mama Grace urged. "You did not die when you gave blood for that boy. You will not die now." With one final cry that tore through her chest, Ruth pushed. A baby's wail cut through the storm. "It's a boy," Mama Grace said, tears shining in her eyes. "A strong boy." She placed the child on Ruth's chest. His skin was red and wrinkled, his cry loud and fierce. Ruth sobbed with relief. "My son," she whispered. "My miracle." As the rain softened outside, Ruth held her child close, exhausted but alive. In that fragile moment, she understood something deeply. She had been abandoned, she had been mocked, she had been broken, but she had not been defeated. The days after Miracle's birth did not bring relief. They brought routine, heavy, unforgiving routine that demanded strength Ruth did not always feel she had. Motherhood did not erase hunger. Love did not pay school fees. And giving birth did not silence the village. Ruth wrapped Miracle tightly against her back with a faded cloth and returned to the market before her body had fully healed. The stitches still pulled when she bent. Her breasts ached. Sleep came in short, broken pieces. Yet every morning, she rose before dawn, boiled water over a small fire, and whispered prayers she barely believed would be answered. "Today we will survive," she told her son. "Tomorrow we will try again." Some people pitied her. A few customers slipped extra coins into her hand and looked away quickly as if kindness were something to be ashamed of. Others were less gentle. "See what love has done to her," one woman remarked loudly one afternoon as Ruth measured palm oil into a small bottle. The man is in the city enjoying life. She is here smelling pepper smoke." Another laughed. "I heard he drives a car now. Look at the woman who carried him on her head." Ruth smiled tightly and thanked them for stopping by even when they bought nothing. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. At night, she counted her coins on the floor beside Miracle's sleeping mat. Sometimes the money was just enough for gari and vegetables. Sometimes it was not. On those nights, she drank water to quiet her stomach and told herself hunger was temporary. Miracle grew quickly, but not strongly. He was thin, his ribs visible beneath his skin, his eyes too large for his small face. He fell sick often, coughs that lingered, fevers that came without warning. Each illness filled Ruth with terror. She ran from one neighbor to another begging for small money. Some gave. Others shook their heads apologetically. She sold parts of her harvest cheaply to buy medicine, watching her profit disappear before it ever reached her hands. One night, when Miracle burned with fever and whimpered weakly in her arms, Ruth broke completely. "Please," she cried softly into the darkness, "don't take him. You already took everything else. Don't leave me alone in this world." She rocked him until her arms ached, until dawn crept through the cracks in the wall. By morning, the fever eased. From that day on, Ruth made a quiet promise to herself. "Everything I suffered for Daniel," she whispered, "I will now use to fight for my child." Years passed. Miracle learned to walk, then to run. He fetched small buckets of water from the stream, careful not to spill. He followed Ruth to the farm, pulling weeds with serious concentration, singing softly as he worked. Despite everything, he was gentle. At night, Ruth sat beside him under the weak glow of a kerosene lamp while he bent over battered school books donated by the church. She watched his brow furrow in concentration and felt both pride and pain twist inside her chest. "Study well," she told him often. "Let your pen be your revenge. Not anger, not fists. Success will answer those who mocked us." Miracle nodded, though he did not fully understand. He only knew his mother carried sadness behind her eyes and strength in her spine. One evening, as they walked home beneath a fading orange sky, Miracle asked the question Ruth had dreaded for years. "Mother?" He said quietly, "Where is my father?" Ruth stopped walking. For a moment, the world tilted. The sound of insects buzzed loudly in her ears. She looked down at her son and saw Daniel's eyes staring back at her, the same shape, the same curiosity. She knelt in front of him, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "Your father went far away," she said carefully. "Is he dead?" Miracle asked. Her throat tightened. "No. Does he know I am alive?" The innocence of the question pierced her deeper than cruelty ever could. "We will talk about it when you are older," she said softly. "But listen to me. You are not a mistake. You are a gift." Miracle seemed satisfied, at least for that day. Far away in a city filled with glass buildings and bright lights, Daniel lived a life Ruth could not imagine. He wore suits now. He signed documents in air-conditioned offices. He laughed in restaurants where a single meal cost more than Ruth earned in weeks. He married a woman from the city, educated, elegant, admired. No one there knew about the woman in the village who had once almost died for him. But Daniel's house was quiet. At first, he did not worry. "We just married," he told his wife Laura. "Children will come." Months passed. Years followed. Each month ended the same way, with disappointment. Doctors ran tests. One spoke gently but firmly. "Your sperm count is very low. The issue is not with your wife." Shame flooded Daniel's body. At home, arguments replaced laughter. "Your sisters all have children." Laura snapped one night. "Why is ours different?" "Am I God?" Daniel shouted back. One evening, in frustration and tears, Laura said something that struck him like lightning. Maybe you hurt someone badly in your past. Daniel dismissed it aloud, but the words followed him into sleep. He began to dream. He dreamed of a hospital bed fever burning through his body. He dreamed of Ruth's face above him, pale but determined as she gave blood. He dreamed of a bridge collapsing beneath his feet, turning into a crying woman asking, "Why did you leave me?" He woke soaked in sweat. One night he turned to Laura in the dark. "Do you think God punishes people?" he asked quietly. She sighed. "Some things are deeper than hospitals," she replied. "Maybe you need to ask your elders." Daniel resisted the thought. But as years passed and his house remained empty of children's voices, his pride began to crack. "Maybe," he whispered one day alone in his car, "there's something I left unfinished. In Igbo land, elders say a man who runs from his shadow will meet it when the sun is highest." Daniel did not yet know it, but his shadow was waiting, grown tall, thin, and bright-eyed in a small village under the same unforgiving sun. The push did not come all at once. It came in waves, quiet conversations, unanswered prayers, and a silence in Daniel's house that grew heavier with each passing year. Laura tried everything she knew how to try: doctors, pastors, fasting, night vigils. Nothing changed. The silence remained. One Saturday morning, Laura sat at the edge of their bed, her eyes swollen from crying. The sun filtered through the curtains, but it brought no warmth. "I heard something," she said softly. Daniel looked up from his phone. "Heard what?" "There's a healer," she continued. "An old man. People say he handles things doctors cannot. He lives not far from your village side." Daniel frowned immediately. "You want me to start moving around native shrines now?" Laura's voice did not rise. It weakened. "I want a child. I don't care if the answer comes from a hospital, a church, or herbs. I'm tired of waiting." The fear beneath her anger was clear. Fear of being blamed. Fear of being called barren. Fear of waking up one day to realize her life had passed without the sound of a child's laughter. Daniel sighed deeply. "All right," he said at last. "I'll go and ask first. If it makes sense, I'll call you." The journey east felt longer than he remembered. As the city fell behind him and the roads narrowed, memories crept back in. The smell of red soil. The rhythm of village life. The tightness in his chest grew with every familiar landmark he passed. He reached Umuai, but did not go to his family house. Shame held his feet. Instead, he drove further to a nearby village where the healer lived. Elder Moses sat outside his compound, pounding herbs slowly in a wooden mortar. His hair was white like ash, his back slightly bent, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Good afternoon," Sir Daniel greeted. "Good afternoon, my son," the old man replied calmly. "Sit. What brings you?" Daniel sat and explained his problem quickly. He spoke of hospitals, of doctors, of weak results. He skipped details, he buried names, he avoided the past. "I need medicine," he concluded, "something to help my body." Elder Moses watched him quietly for a long moment. "You want medicine?" the old man said slowly. "But what if your sickness is not only in your body?" Daniel shifted on the stool. "What do you mean?" "When a tree refuses to bear fruit," Elder Moses replied, "sometimes the problem is not the leaves, it is the root." He stood up and walked around Daniel, studying him as if looking for something invisible. "Tell me," he said gently, "is there any woman you promised marriage and abandoned? Any tears you walked away from, any child you denied?" Daniel's heart began to race. "No," he answered too quickly, "nothing like that." Elder Moses smiled sadly. "You can lie to me," he said. "You can lie to your wife. But you cannot lie to the ground that drank that woman's tears." He walked to a small calabash filled with water, murmured words under his breath, then beckoned Daniel closer. "Look." Daniel leaned forward. At first he saw only his own reflection. Then the image shifted. A dusty village road, a pregnant woman crying, a man stepping onto a bus without looking back. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. "Stop," he whispered. "What is this?" That elder Moses said quietly, "Is your road. Until you return to it, your house will remain empty." Daniel's mouth was dry. "Is she still alive?" "If she is alive, you will find her," the old man replied. "If she is not, her tears are still waiting." The words followed Daniel as he drove back toward his family compound, his hands tight on the steering wheel. When he arrived, children he did not recognize were playing in the yard. His younger sister came out a baby balanced on her hip. "Daniel," she exclaimed. "Big man from the city, you remembered us." Their mother appeared behind her, older, now thinner, but smiling wide. "My son," she said warmly, "you have come. Maybe now God will also visit you with a child." The words pierced him. Later, as they ate yam and palm oil together, Daniel asked casually, "How is everyone in the village?" His sister laughed. "Everybody is fine. Well, some are more fine than others. You remember Ruth," she added lightly. Daniel's spoon froze in midair. "Which Ruth?" he asked. "Ah, this man," his sister chuckled. "The one that followed you like a shadow. The one that almost built you from nothing," their mother hissed softly. "Leave that matter." "But she's still here," the sister continued, "living with that boy of hers." "What boy?" Daniel asked, his voice barely steady. "Miracle," she replied. "The one that looks exactly like you when you were small. If not that, we know you can't have children." She stopped suddenly. Silence filled the room. "There is a boy," Daniel whispered. "Yes," his sister said carefully. "Everybody knows. When you left, she was already pregnant." Daniel pushed his plate away. That night he walked the familiar paths of the village like a stranger. When he finally reached Ruth's compound, he stopped short. She stood outside, stirring a pot over a small fire. Her back was slightly bent. A young boy sat nearby, laughing softly. The boy turned his head. Daniel's world collapsed. The same eyes, the same chin, the same face. Ruth looked up and saw him. The spoon fell from her hand. For a long moment no one spoke. Ruth Daniel whispered, her eyes hardened. "Go inside, Miracle," she said quietly. The boy obeyed, glancing back once. Daniel stepped forward. "I'm sorry." Ruth turned away. "Keep your sorry," she said. "It is too late." And for the first time Daniel understood. The road he had run from had finally caught him. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay on the thin mat in his mother's house, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of crickets and murmured conversations drifting through the village. Each time he closed his eyes, the same image returned the boy's face. Miracle, his face, his blood, my son. The words echoed in his mind, heavy and undeniable. Before dawn, Daniel rose and washed his face with cold water. He needed to see Ruth again. Not in the quiet of her compound where pain hung thick in the air, but in a place where words could no longer be swallowed, where the truth would be forced into the open. The market. By mid-morning, the village market buzzed with its usual energy. Women arranged cassava peppers and palm oil. Men argued loudly over prices. Children darted between stalls. Life moved forward, careless of broken promises. Ruth sat on a low stool beside her small table, neatly arranging vegetables. Miracle stood beside her, holding a tray of oranges. He was taller now than Daniel had first noticed, his movements quick and sure. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Ruth," he said gently. She did not look up. Instead, she turned to her son. "Miracle, take these oranges to Mama Grace," she said calmly. "Come back quickly." The boy obeyed, though his eyes flicked towards Daniel with curiosity. When he disappeared into the crowd, Ruth finally faced Daniel. "Speak," she said flatly. "People are listening." Daniel glanced around. Indeed, several vendors had slowed their movements, ears tilted in their direction. "I know I hurt you," he began, his voice low but clear. "I know I was wicked." Ruth laughed softly without humor. "Wicked," she repeated. "Is that what you call abandoning a pregnant woman after she saved your life?" Daniel swallowed. "I have no excuse." "You had excuses," then she shot back, "plenty of them. City life, big dreams. Shame of a village woman." The words stung because they were true. "I was young," Daniel said. "I was foolish. When I got to the city, I wanted to belong. They told me marrying a woman like you would pull me down. And you believed them," Ruth said quietly. "Yes," he admitted. "I believed them." Ruth's eyes filled with tears she did not bother to hide. "Do you know what it means," she asked, "to push a child into this world alone, to watch him ask for his father and have no answer, to work until your bones cry just so he can eat?" People nearby stopped pretending not to listen. "Do you know the names they called me?" she continued. "Do you know how many nights I wanted to die?" Daniel felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please let me be in his life now, even if it's as a distant uncle." Ruth shook her head slowly. "Help?" she asked. "Where was your help 10 years ago?" He had no answer. "Listen carefully," she said after a pause. "You cannot walk in now and scatter the small life I built. He trusts me. I will not let you confuse him." Daniel nodded, shame heavy in his eyes, but Ruth added, "If you truly regret what you did, prove it. Not with words, with actions." "I will," Daniel said quietly. From that day he helped from the shadows. He went to Miracle School and paid the fees, asking the headmaster to say only that a sponsor believed in the boy. He bought books and uniforms. He quietly arranged for Ruth's market supplier to reduce her prices. Ruth noticed the changes. She felt them in the ease of small moments, food lasting longer, Miracle returning from school with excitement. "One man is sponsoring me," Miracle announced one evening, smiling brightly. Ruth forced a smile. "God is watching us," she replied, though her heart trembled with questions. Weeks later, trouble returned. Miracle collapsed at school. By the time Ruth reached the small clinic in the neighboring town, he lay motionless on a narrow bed, his breathing shallow. "He is very weak," the nurse said. "We must transfer him to the general hospital. We need money now." Ruth's world spun. "Please," she begged. "I will pay small. This is not market," the nurse replied tiredly. Ruth ran from one person to another, desperation tearing at her dignity. The money was not enough. As evening fell, Miracle's condition worsened. His small body shook with fever. Ruth dropped to her knees beside the bed. "Please, God," she cried, "don't punish my child for a sin he didn't commit." A shadow entered the ward. "Ruth." She looked up, startled, and saw Daniel standing there, fear etched deeply across his face. "The headmaster called me," he explained. "He said Miracle fainted." Daniel stepped to the bed, his heart breaking at the sight of his son. "How much?" he asked the nurse. He paid immediately. For 3 days, Ruth and Daniel waited together in the hospital corridor, bound by fear and guilt. On the second night, Miracle opened his eyes. "Mother," he whispered. Ruth rushed to his side. He noticed Daniel standing behind her. "Who is that man?" Miracle asked faintly. "He's always here." Daniel stepped forward. "I am your father," he said softly. Silence filled the room. Miracle looked from his mother to Daniel. "Is it true?" "Yes," Ruth whispered. "Where were you?" Miracle asked. Daniel's voice broke. "I was foolish. I ran from my responsibility. I hurt your mother." "I hurt you." Miracle closed his eyes briefly. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, "but thank you for saving my life." Those words struck Daniel harder than anger ever could. Far away in the city, Laura paced their living room. When she finally learned the truth, betrayal flooded her heart. By the time Daniel returned days later, their marriage stood on the edge of collapse. "You let me suffer," Laura cried. "You let me carry shame while your son lived without you." "I was ashamed," Daniel said. "I thought hiding it would make it disappear." "It didn't," she replied coldly. "Fix what you broke." Back in the village, Miracle grew stronger. Daniel returned often, repairing things, helping where he could. One evening, under the glow of a kerosene lamp, Ruth spoke softly. "I forgive you," she said. "Not because you deserve it, but because I am tired of carrying hatred." Miracle hesitated, then nodded. "We can start small." Daniel bowed his head, tears falling freely. At last, the road he abandoned had brought him back not to glory, but to truth. Daniel stayed. At first, the village did not believe it. People were used to men who came and went, men who made promises when it suited them and vanished when responsibility knocked. They watched him closely, waiting for the familiar pattern to repeat itself. But Daniel did not leave. He moved into a small empty room beside his mother's compound, close enough to Ruth's house to be present, yet far enough to respect the boundaries she had drawn. He woke before sunrise and followed the same dusty paths he had once despised. He carried water from the stream. He joined farmers in the fields, his hands blistering quickly, his city-soft skin protesting every movement. The work humbled him. On the first day he followed Miracle to the farm, the boy walked several steps ahead, silent and guarded. Daniel tried to speak about the weather, about school, but Miracle answered only in short words. Each silence felt like a deserved punishment. Ruth watched from a distance. She noticed the way Daniel bent clumsily over the soil, struggling with a hoe he once knew well. She saw him return home exhausted, sweat-soaked, yet still rise again the next morning without complaint. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to observe without anger leading her eyes. The villagers talked. "Is that not Daniel the big man?" one asked, incredulous. "Yes," another replied. "The same one who denied his own blood. Look at him now," a third said. "Farming with the boy he abandoned." Some shook their heads. Others nodded slowly. In Umue, people believed life had a way of folding back on itself. Miracle remained distant, but he watched everything. He noticed how Daniel waited before entering the compound, never stepping in without permission. He saw how Daniel brought food and left it quietly at the door, never demanding gratitude. He saw the way Daniel's eyes softened whenever Ruth spoke, even when her words were firm and cold. One evening, Miracle broke the silence. "Why are you still here?" he asked suddenly as they walked back from the stream. Daniel stopped. "Because running almost destroyed me," he answered honestly. "And because I don't want to run from you anymore." Miracle considered this quietly. He did not respond, but that night he did not move away when Daniel sat nearby. Ruth struggled with her own emotions. Forgiveness did not erase memory. Some nights she still woke with the echo of Daniel's cruel words in her ears. Some mornings she looked at his bowed head and felt a surge of anger she did not know how to release, but she was tired. Tired of hatred. Tired of carrying bitterness like a second child on her back. Tired of allowing the past to poison every breath of the present. One evening, as the three of them sat outside under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, Ruth spoke. "We cannot pretend nothing happened," she said quietly, "but we also cannot keep bleeding forever." Daniel nodded. "I know, I forgave you," she continued, "so my heart could rest. Not so you could forget what you did. I will never forget," he replied. Miracle listened carefully. "Forgiveness," Ruth added, "does not mean trust comes immediately. Trust must be earned." Daniel lowered his head. "I will earn it," he said. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Daniel repaired broken steps at the church without being asked. He paid old debts his family still carried. He helped widows with farm work, not to be praised, but because he knew what it meant to be abandoned. Slowly, the whispers in the village changed. Maybe he has truly changed, some said. Time will tell, others replied. One afternoon, Miracle returned from school with news that shook him. "Mother," he said quietly, "my classmates asked why my father never comes for school meetings." Ruth felt her chest tighten. Daniel, who stood nearby, waited. "It's your decision," he said softly. "I won't push." Ruth studied her son's face. The boy had grown taller, stronger. His eyes carried questions that deserved answers. "Do you want him there?" she asked. Miracle hesitated. I don't know," he admitted. "But I don't want to lie anymore." The next school meeting Daniel attended. He did not arrive with arrogance. He sat at the back, listened, and spoke only when addressed. When teachers mentioned Miracle's intelligence and discipline, Daniel felt pride swell in his chest, quiet, painful pride. Miracle noticed. Something shifted. That evening, Miracle sat beside Daniel without being asked. "I still remember my mother crying," he said softly. Daniel closed his eyes. "I know. You can't erase that." Miracle continued. "But if you stay, maybe we can build something new." Daniel's throat tightened. "I will stay." Ruth watched them from the doorway, her heart heavy but hopeful. News from the city arrived like distant thunder. Laura sent a message asking for time, space. She needed to understand whether their marriage could survive truth. Daniel did not argue. For the first time in his life, he accepted consequences without resistance. "I deserve this," he told Ruth quietly. Ruth did not comment. Some lessons could only be learned alone. As seasons changed, Miracle grew healthier. His laughter returned more easily. He began to call Daniel father in private, the word still fragile on his tongue. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Miracle spoke again. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" he asked. Daniel did not flinch. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of facing who I was." Miracle nodded slowly. "I'm afraid too," he said. "But I don't want to be afraid forever." Daniel smiled sadly. "Neither do I." Ruth felt something loosen inside her chest. She understood then that healing was not a single moment, but a series of small, deliberate choices. Staying, listening, owning mistakes without demanding forgiveness. In the quiet of Umwe village, beneath the same sun that once witnessed abandonment, a broken family began slowly, painfully to rebuild itself. Not because the past had changed, but because they finally faced it together. Even as Daniel tried to rebuild something fragile in Umwe, the city he left behind did not stay silent. Lagos had a way of demanding answers, even when you were not ready to give them. While Daniel's hands learned again the weight of soil and sweat, his phone vibrated with messages he could no longer ignore. Laura was asking for time. At first, the messages were short and distant. "I need space. I'm staying with my sister for now. We will talk later." Daniel read them slowly, feeling each word settle like a stone in his chest. He did not argue. He did not beg. For once, he accepted that silence was a consequence he had earned. Back in Umwe, Ruth noticed the change in him. He grew quieter in the evenings, often sitting alone beneath a mango tree after the day's work, staring into nothing. She did not ask questions. Pain had taught her that some truths needed time to rise on their own. Miracle, however, noticed everything. One night, as crickets sang and the kerosene lamp flickered, Miracle sat beside Daniel and spoke with the careful seriousness of a child forced to grow too early. "My teacher says the city is where dreams come true," he said. "Is that true?" Daniel considered the question for a long moment. "The city can give you things," he replied slowly. "Money, comfort, a name people respect. Miracle nodded. Then why did it almost destroy you? The honesty of the question stunned him, because Daniel answered, I went there chasing success and left my conscience behind. Miracle absorbed this quietly. I don't want to be like that, he said. Daniel met his gaze. Then don't run from who you are. Far away, in a high-rise apartment filled with polished furniture and cold air, Laura replayed the past 10 years in her mind like a film she could no longer pause. She remembered the doctor's offices, the whispered comments from relatives, the pitying looks that followed her whenever children were mentioned. All that time she had blamed herself. Now the truth burned. When Daniel finally returned to Lagos to face her, he did not arrive with excuses. He stood in the doorway, thinner, darker, from the sun stripped of the city's false armor. Laura looked at him with eyes that had cried too much. You have a son, she said flatly. Yes, Daniel replied. I do, and you let me suffer, she continued. You let everyone think I was the problem. I was ashamed, he admitted. I thought if I buried it, it would disappear. Laura laughed bitterly. Pain doesn't disappear when you bury it. It grows. Daniel lowered his head. I went back, he said quietly. I faced her, I faced him, and Laura asked, and I stayed. Silence stretched between them. I don't know if I can stay married to you, Laura said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. Those words marked a turning point. For the first time, Daniel did not fight for control. He let go. When he returned to Umuwai, the village welcomed him with the same cautious curiosity. But something else had changed Daniel himself. He no longer moved like a man performing repentance. He moved like a man who had accepted responsibility as a permanent state, not a temporary act. Miracle noticed it too. One afternoon, while they worked together repairing a broken fence, Miracle spoke again. My classmate said something today, he said. Daniel paused. What did they say? They said my father left me because he didn't want me. Daniel felt the words strike deep. Did you answer them? He asked. Miracle shook his head. I didn't know what to say. Daniel knelt to Miracle's level, his voice steady but heavy with truth. I left because I was afraid, he said, not because of you, never because of you. Miracle studied his face, searching for lies. Finding none, he nodded slowly. That evening, Ruth watched her son sit closer to Daniel than before. The space between them was shrinking not through words, but through consistency. Ruth's heart softened in cautious steps. She still remembered every insult, every night of hunger, every tear shed in silence. Forgiveness had not erased memory, but it had loosened its grip. One night, she spoke honestly for the first time. I don't regret loving you, she said quietly as they sat beneath the stars. But I regret losing myself for you. Daniel listened without interrupting. I won't ask you to trust me fully, he replied. I will only ask you to watch me stay. And he did. Seasons turned, the rains came and went. Miracle's health improved. His laughter returned brighter and freer. He began to speak of dreams not of escaping the village, but of becoming something greater than the pain that shaped him. I want to be a teacher, he said one day, or a doctor. Ruth smiled through tears. You will be whatever you choose, she told him. Daniel watched from the doorway, understanding at last what true success looked like. Not applause, not wealth, but presence. Yet the final test had not arrived. One morning, a letter came from Lagos. Laura had made her decision. She would come to the village. The news sent a ripple through Daniel's chest. Fear mixed with relief. There were truths still standing, waiting to be faced by all of them together. When Laura arrived, she stood out immediately, her city clothes stark against the red earth, her posture rigid with unease. Villagers stared openly. Ruth watched from her doorway, calm but alert. The meeting was quiet. No shouting, no accusations. Laura spoke first. "I came to see the woman who raised my husband's son," she said. Ruth met her gaze. "I raised my son," she corrected gently. "Your husband chose not to." Laura nodded. "You're right." They sat together, two women bound by the same man's choices, neither enemies nor friends. "I blamed myself for years," Laura said softly. "I wish I'd known the truth earlier." Ruth held her silence, then replied, "I wish I had not paid for a lie with my life." The words were heavy but necessary. Laura turned to Daniel. "Whatever happens between us," she said, "you must be a father to that boy." "I am," Daniel replied firmly, "and I will not run again." When Laura left the village days later, she left with clarity, if not certainty. Back in Umuai, life resumed its rhythm. One evening, Miracle spoke the words Daniel had waited years to hear, without pressure or demand. "Father," he said softly but clearly. Daniel's breath caught. "Yes, my son," Miracle smiled. "Help me with my homework." In that simple request, Daniel found redemption more powerful than any apology. The city had given him wealth and taken his soul. The village had taken his pride and given him back his humanity. And in the quiet between past and future, a broken story was learning how to continue honestly, humbly, and at last without running. Laura's visit left a quiet storm behind. After she returned to the city, Umuai village slowly settled back into its routines, but something invisible had shifted. People no longer whispered as much when Daniel passed. They watched with a different kind of curiosity, now less judgment, more wondering. It was as if the village itself was asking whether this man would finally finish what he had begun. Daniel felt it too. For years, his life had been divided into compartments, city and village, past and present, guilt and denial. Now, those walls were collapsing. Each morning, as he rose before dawn to follow Miracle to school or walk with Ruth to the farm, he felt the weight of unfinished business pressing against his chest. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with orange and purple, Daniel sat alone beneath a mango tree. The air was thick with the sound of insects and distant laughter from neighboring compounds. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "I can't keep standing in the middle," he whispered to himself. "I have to choose." The next day, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including Ruth. "I'm taking Miracle to Lagos," Daniel said carefully as they sat outside Ruth's house. "Just for a short visit." During the school break, Ruth stiffened. "Why, so he can see where I live," Daniel replied. "So he understands both worlds, and so there are no more shadows." Miracle's eyes widened. "The city?" he asked. Ruth studied Daniel's face, searching for arrogance, for hidden motives. She found none, only seriousness and restraint. "You will not confuse him," she said slowly. "You will not use him to prove anything." "I won't," Daniel promised. "He will come back when school resumes." Miracle looked between them, excitement and fear mingling on his face. "I want to go," he said quietly, "but I want to come back too." Ruth nodded. "You will." The journey to Lagos felt different this time. Daniel did not rush. He did not boast. He explained things patiently, why buildings were tall, why traffic never slept, why people always seemed to be running. Miracle listened wide-eyed. At Daniel's apartment, Miracle explored carefully, touching everything as if afraid it might disappear. He slept on a soft bed for the first time in his life. He stared at the city lights from the balcony in silence. "Mother would like this," he said eventually. Daniel's chest tightened. "She deserves it." They visited Daniel's office briefly. Colleagues smiled politely, unaware of the history standing beside him. Miracle watched quietly, absorbing more than he spoke. That night, Laura came to see them. She stood awkwardly at the doorway, her gaze landing on Miracle with a mixture of pain and curiosity. "So, this is him," she said softly. Miracle nodded respectfully. "Good evening, Ma." Laura smiled faintly. "Good evening." They sat together, the three of them sharing tea in silence before Laura finally spoke. "I'm not here to compete," she said to Miracle, "or to take anything from you." Miracle considered her words carefully. "I'm not angry with you," he said honestly. "I'm angry with my father." Daniel lowered his head. Laura nodded. "That's fair." When she left, Miracle turned to Daniel. "She's sad," he said. "Yes," Daniel replied, "because truth hurts before it heals." The visit ended without drama. Miracle returned to Umuai with stories, but also with clarity. "The city is loud," he told Ruth, "but our home is quiet in a good way." Ruth smiled and pulled him close. Daniel, however, felt the final reckoning approaching. One afternoon, Elder Moses sent word asking Daniel to visit him again. The old man sat beneath the same tree, his eyes sharp as ever. "You went back," Elder Moses said. "But have you finished?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. You repaired walls," the elder continued. "You paid fees. You stayed. But have you spoken the truth publicly? Have you carried your shame where it belongs?" Daniel understood immediately. The following Sunday, the village gathered at the church compound. The air buzzed with expectation. Daniel stood before them, his hands trembling slightly. "I left this village years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I abandoned a woman who saved my life. I denied my own child." Gasps rippled through the gathering. "I cannot undo the pain I caused," Daniel continued. "But I stand here to claim my responsibility openly. Miracle is my son. Ruth is the woman I wronged. I ask for no praise, only the chance to do right from this day forward." Silence followed. Then an elderly man stepped forward. "The ground has heard you," he said. "Now let your actions continue to speak." Ruth felt tears gather in her eyes, not from weakness, but from release. That night, as the moon rose over Umuay, Ruth spoke to Daniel with a calm she had not known before. "You faced it," she said, "all of it." "I had to," Daniel replied. "For him, for you, for myself." Miracle listened quietly, understanding that something final had been sealed. The past had demanded its answer. And for the first time, Daniel had not run. After Daniel spoke before the village, Umuai felt strangely lighter, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. The confession did not erase memory, but it rearranged it. People no longer had to whisper. What had lived in shadows now stood in daylight. For Ruth, the days that followed were quiet but intense. She woke each morning with a familiar ache in her back and a new calm in her chest. Shame no longer walked ahead of her like a warning sign. It followed behind, smaller, now no longer in control. Miracle noticed the difference immediately. At school, his classmates no longer pointed or speculated. Teachers greeted Daniel openly when he came for meetings. The word "father" was no longer a question mark hanging over Miracle's head. It had a face, a voice, and a presence. Still, acceptance did not come all at once. One afternoon, as Ruth returned from the stream, she heard raised voices near the village square. A small crowd had gathered. At the center stood Daniel, facing two older men from the extended family. "You think saying sorry in public wipes away 10 years, one of them demanded. Daniel did not raise his voice. "No," he said simply, "it doesn't." "Then why should we trust you?" the other asked. "Men come here, make noise, and disappear again." Daniel nodded. "That fear is fair. All I can offer is time." The men exchanged glances. One finally stepped back. "Time will judge you," he said. That was enough. Ruth watched from a distance, her heart steady. She did not rush to defend Daniel. This was his road to walk. Later that evening, Miracle spoke what had been growing quietly inside him. "When people say your name now," he said to Daniel, "they look at me differently." Daniel turned to him. "Is that bad?" Miracle shook his head. "No, it just feels heavy." Daniel understood. A name carried history. It carried expectation. "If you ever want to use your mother's name alone," Daniel said gently, "you can. You don't owe me anything." Miracle looked at him for a long moment. "I want both," he said finally. "I want to know where I come from." Ruth listened, her heart tightening and softening at the same time. This was the balance she had prayed for without knowing how to name it. As weeks passed, Daniel's presence became ordinary. He attended church quietly. He worked without complaint. He paid school fees openly, now no longer hiding behind intermediaries. He helped Ruth repair the roof of her house before the rains returned, climbing carefully, measuring twice, working until his hands ached. One evening, as they sat outside, Ruth spoke words she had not planned. "I never thought I would sit like this with you again," she said. Daniel did not answer immediately. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I used to imagine telling you everything you did to me," she continued, "every insult. Every night I went to bed hungry. Every time I wiped tears so Miracle wouldn't see." Daniel's throat tightened. "You can still tell me." Ruth shook her head slowly. "I don't need to anymore. The pain knows you've seen it." Daniel felt tears rise, but he did not wipe them away. News from Lagos came again, this time clearer. Laura called Daniel one evening. Her voice was calmer, steadier. "I've thought a lot," she said. "I don't hate you, but I can't pretend the past didn't change us." "I understand," Daniel replied. "I'm not ready to be part of that village life," Laura continued. "And I don't think I can be a stepmother to a child born from a lie." Daniel closed his eyes. "I won't force you. We'll separate," she said softly, peacefully. When the call ended, Daniel sat in silence for a long time. Ruth did not celebrate. Loss was still loss, even when deserved. "I never wanted your marriage to break because of me," she said quietly. "It didn't break because of you," Daniel replied. "It broke because of me." Miracle watched them both carefully. That night he asked a question that surprised Ruth. "Mother," he said, "are you happy?" She paused. Happiness had once felt like a dangerous word. "I am lighter," she answered honestly, "and that's enough for now." Miracle nodded thoughtfully. The rainy season arrived in full force. Crops struggled, roads flooded. Life tested everyone again without discrimination. One night, a storm tore through the village. Wind howled. Rain beat hard against roofs. Ruth's house shook under the force. Daniel ran through the rain to check on them, soaked to the bone by the time he arrived. The roof held. Ruth laughed softly in relief. "You fixed it well." Daniel smiled. "I'm learning." They sat together through the storm, listening to thunder roll across the sky. Miracle slept between them, peaceful. In that moment, Daniel understood something he had missed for years. Belonging was not about status. It was about shelter, being where your presence mattered when things fell apart. The next morning, the storm passed, leaving behind broken branches and fresh air. Villagers gathered to clear debris together. Daniel worked alongside them without instruction, lifting, carrying, sweating like everyone else. An elderly woman watched him and nodded. "The ground accepts effort," she said quietly. Ruth felt pride, not the sharp kind that demands recognition, but the steady kind that warms from inside. Later that week, Miracle received a letter. He had been selected for a regional academic competition. Ruth cried openly this time, her tears unhidden and free. "You see," she told him, "your pen is answering." Daniel hugged his son carefully, as if still afraid the moment might disappear. "I'm proud of you," he said. Miracle smiled. "I know." As the village prepared for the competition, Ruth realized something profound. Her life had not returned to what it was before Daniel left. It had become something else entirely stronger, scarred, but real. She was no longer the woman waiting by the road. She was the woman who stood survived and chose peace without forgetting truth. And for the first time, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like a question she was finally ready to answer. Life did not suddenly become gentle after truth was spoken. In Umwai, peace was not a gift that arrived fully formed. It was something earned in small daily decisions. Ruth learned this as she always had by waking before dawn, tying her wrapper, and choosing steadiness over bitterness. Daniel learned it too. After the public confession, the village did not shower him with forgiveness. Respect returned slowly, cautiously. Men greeted him with nods rather than smiles. Women watched how he treated Ruth when no one was calling his name. Children observed whether he showed up when rain fell or when work was hard, and Daniel showed up. He accompanied Miracle to school, even on mornings when the road was flooded. He sat through long church services without checking his phone. He attended community meetings and spoke only when asked. He did not try to buy acceptance. He worked for it. One afternoon, as Ruth sorted cassava behind her house, she heard footsteps and familiar laughter. She turned to see Daniel and Miracle approaching, both muddy, both grinning. "We helped Uncle Chukwudi fix his fence," Miracle announced proudly. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Did he ask you?" "No," Daniel admitted. "But it was falling." Ruth shook her head with a faint smile. "You're learning," she said. Still, some wounds needed more time. At school, Miracle excelled, but whispers followed him. Not cruel, not loud, just curious. "That's the boy whose father left and came back," someone said. Miracle heard it all. One evening, he sat alone outside, tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. Ruth noticed and sat beside him. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Miracle hesitated. "If Father hadn't come back," he said slowly, "would my life be simpler?" Ruth considered the question carefully. "Simpler doesn't always mean better," she replied. "And better doesn't always feel easy." Miracle nodded. "Sometimes I wish I didn't have to explain." Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't owe anyone your story," she said. "You only owe yourself honesty." Daniel, listening from a distance, felt the weight of those words. He realized then that even his presence, necessary and right, had consequences Miracle would carry. Redemption did not erase complexity. It rearranged it. The academic competition approached quickly. Miracle studied late into the night, his face serious beneath the lamplight. Daniel sat nearby, pretending to read, watching quietly. "You're nervous," Daniel said gently. Miracle nodded. "I want to win. Not for prizes, for proof." For who, Daniel asked. Miracle thought, for myself. And for Mother. Daniel smiled. "That's the best reason." The day of the competition arrived with clear skies and restless excitement. Ruth dressed Miracle carefully, smoothing his shirt, kissing his forehead longer than usual. "Remember," she whispered, "your worth doesn't change today." Miracle nodded, though his hands trembled. Daniel walked them to the bus stop. As Miracle climbed aboard with other students, he paused and looked back. "Wait for me," he said. "We will," Ruth replied. The hours stretched painfully. Ruth tried to keep busy, but her thoughts wandered. Daniel paced beneath the mango tree, replaying every moment of the last 10 years. By evening, the bus returned. Miracle stepped down, eyes shining. "I didn't win first place," he announced quickly before anyone could ask. Ruth's heart dipped. "But I placed second," he added, grinning widely. Ruth laughed and cried at the same time, pulling him into a tight embrace. Daniel exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding all day. "Well done," he said simply. That night, as they celebrated with a small meal, Ruth noticed something shift inside her. Pride replaced fear. Gratitude replaced anger. She had not raised a broken child. She had raised a strong one. Days later, an unexpected visitor arrived. Daniel's aunt from another village, a woman known for her bluntness and long memory. She sat heavily on a stool in Ruth's compound eyes sharp and assessing. So the woman began, "You are the one who suffered." Ruth met her gaze calmly. "I am." The aunt turned to Daniel. "You shamed this family." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Silence followed. Then the aunt sighed deeply. "But you have stayed." "Yes," Daniel replied. She looked at Miracle, who stood tall despite his nerves. "And this is the boy." Miracle nodded respectfully. The aunt studied him for a long moment, then stood. "I have nothing else to say," she declared. "Time has spoken." When she left, Ruth felt an unexpected wave of relief. Another door had closed not in anger, but in acceptance. That evening, Ruth spoke words she had kept guarded. "I don't want to be a woman defined only by what I survived," she said quietly to Daniel. "You're not," he replied immediately. "I want to choose what comes next," she continued, "not because of pity, not because of repair, but because I want to." Daniel listened carefully. "What do you want?" Ruth looked out across the fields, the sun sinking low. "I want stability," she said, "for Miracle and for myself. Whether that includes you will depend on how we continue, not on what we lost." Daniel nodded slowly. "I accept that." For the first time, Ruth felt truly in control of her future, not reacting to pain, not compensating for absence, but choosing deliberately. The village noticed. They saw a woman who walked taller, a boy who spoke with confidence, a man who worked without demanding applause. In Umwai, people began to say, this family did not survive because of money. They survived because they faced truth. Late one night, as Ruth lay awake listening to the steady breathing of her son, she reflected on how far she had come. She remembered the girl on the dusty road crying into her wrapper. She was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned that justice did not always come as punishment, but sometimes as growth. And growth, she realized, was the hardest forgiveness of all. Just when life in Umue began to settle into a fragile rhythm, the past returned not as a whisper, but as a knock that could not be ignored. It began with a letter. The envelope was thick official-looking, bearing the stamp of a Lagos law firm. Daniel received it early one morning and stood frozen in the yard long after he had finished reading. His face had lost its color. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the paper and slipped it back inside. Ruth noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. Daniel hesitated. "Laura," he said quietly. "She has filed for a formal separation. There are legal matters to settle." Ruth absorbed the words without visible reaction. She had learned not to panic at news that once would have shattered her. Still, something tightened in her chest. Not jealousy, not fear, but the awareness that unfinished chapters rarely closed quietly. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means I'll need to return to Lagos," Daniel replied. For a short while. Miracle, who had been listening silently, looked up. "Are you leaving again?" The question struck Daniel like a blow. "No," he said firmly, kneeling to Miracle's level. "I'm going to settle what I must. Then I'm coming back." Miracle studied his face, searching for certainty. "You promise?" Daniel nodded. "I promise." Ruth watched closely. Promises, she knew, were easy to give and costly to keep. Before Daniel left, the village gathered quietly. No ceremony, no speeches, just nods and murmured goodbyes. This time, when he stepped onto the bus, Ruth did not chase him. Miracle did not cry. The dust rose just as it had years ago, but this time it did not feel like abandonment. In Lagos, Daniel faced the life he had tried to separate from himself. Laura met him in the law office, composed but distant. The conversation was polite, restrained heavy with things left unsaid. "I don't hate you," she told him calmly, "but I can't build a future on a foundation of lies." Daniel nodded. "You're right." They spoke of assets, timelines, and closure. Laura's voice did not shake, but her eyes carried a grief she no longer tried to hide. "I hope you become the man you should have been," she said finally. "I'm trying," Daniel replied. When Daniel returned to Umuai weeks later, the village greeted him not with suspicion, but with quiet recognition. He had gone and come back again. This time it mattered. But the final test had not yet arrived. One afternoon, as Ruth and Miracle returned from the farm, they found a stranger waiting near their compound. He was well dressed, his shoes too clean for the dusty road, his posture stiff with discomfort. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I'm looking for Ruth." "I am Ruth," she replied cautiously. The man introduced himself as a representative of Daniel's extended family relatives who had lived far away and claimed ignorance of the past until recently. "They want to discuss the boy," he said, glancing at Miracle. "Inheritance, family name, future obligations." Ruth felt her stomach tighten. Miracle stepped closer to her instinctively. "Tell them," Ruth said firmly, "that my son is not a bargaining tool." The man cleared his throat. "They believe he should be brought fully into the family, to live with them, to be raised properly." Daniel arrived just in time to hear those words. "No," he said sharply. "That will not happen." The representative looked surprised. "But he carries your name." "He carries my blood," Daniel corrected, "not my ownership." The conversation ended quickly. The man left unsettled and empty-handed. That evening, tension hung thick in Ruth's house. "This is what I feared," Ruth said quietly. "That when truth comes out, people will start claiming what they once rejected." Daniel nodded. "I won't let anyone take him from you." Miracle spoke up, his voice steady. "I don't want to go anywhere," he said. "This is my home." Ruth pulled him close, her heart pounding with both fear and pride. Days later, the village elders called a meeting. They sat beneath the large iroko tree, their faces serious. Daniel, Ruth, and Miracle stood before them. "You have walked a hard road," one elder said slowly. "And you did not run when truth demanded payment." Another elder spoke. "There are families who would claim the child now that his father has returned. We will not allow injustice to repeat itself." The decision was clear. Miracle would remain with Ruth. Daniel's role would be defined by presence and responsibility, not control. Ruth felt tears rise, not of sorrow, but of vindication. Later that night, Ruth and Daniel spoke privately. "There was a time," Ruth said softly, "when I would have accepted anything just to survive." Daniel listened, his eyes lowered. But now she continued, "I choose dignity, for myself, and for my son." Daniel nodded. "You taught me that." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. "Ruth," Daniel said finally, "I don't expect us to return to what we were." She looked at him. "We can't. But I hope," he continued carefully, "that we can become something honest." Ruth considered his words for a long moment. "Honesty is not a promise," she replied. "It's a habit. I will practice it," Daniel said. The next morning, Ruth watched Miracle walk to school, his steps confident, his shoulders straight. She realized then that the past had knocked one last time and had been answered not with fear, but with boundaries. In Umuai, people began to say, "This woman did not beg for justice. She stood in it." And for Ruth, that was enough. The season shifted quietly, the way change often does in Umuai, without announcement, without drama. The rains thinned into soft showers. The soil breathed again. Fields turned green. And with the land's renewal came a fragile sense of closure that Ruth had never expected to feel. Yet closure, she would learn, was not the absence of pain. It was the presence of peace alongside memory. Miracle's days settled into a rhythm. School in the mornings, farm work in the afternoons, books by lantern light at night. He grew taller, his shoulders broader, his laughter easier. Teachers spoke of his focus, his discipline, his hunger to learn. For the first time, Ruth allowed herself to imagine a future that did not feel like a constant negotiation with fear. Daniel remained steady. He no longer tried to prove himself. He simply lived the proof. He woke early. He worked hard. He listened more than he spoke. When villagers asked for help, he gave it without attaching his name. When people tested him with doubt, he answered with patience. One afternoon, as Ruth prepared vegetables outside her house, Daniel approached slowly. "There's something I want to ask," he said. Ruth looked up, alert but calm. "Go on. I want to build a proper room for Miracle," Daniel continued, "not to change where he lives, just to make his space better. A desk, a shelf, light." Ruth considered this. Years ago, she would have accepted anything without question. Now she weighed intention. "Do it," she said finally. "But remember, it's his space, not a gift to claim him." Daniel nodded. "I understand." They worked together over the next weeks. Daniel measured and cut wood. Ruth supervised quietly, correcting small details. Miracle helped where he could, proud to see something built for him with care rather than pity. When the room was finished, Miracle stood inside it, silently touching the smooth desk, the small bookshelf. "This is mine?" he asked. "Yes," Ruth replied, "because you earned it." That night, Miracle studied longer than usual, his face lit with purpose. But not all tests came gently. One evening, a group of young men passed Daniel on the road, laughter sharp in their voices. City Man 1 called out. Enjoying village life now, Daniel stopped and faced them. "I am." Another smirked. Funny how a man remembers a responsibility only after failure. The word stung, but Daniel did not react. "You're right," he said simply. "It took failure to wake me." The men fell silent, unsure what to do with honesty that refused to fight back. Ruth watched from afar, her respect deepening in ways she did not name aloud. The final challenge came unexpectedly, wrapped in kindness rather than cruelty. Mama Grace fell ill. The old woman who had helped Ruth deliver Miracle now lay weak in her compound fever burning through her frail body. Without hesitation, Ruth organized help. Daniel arranged transport to the clinic. Miracle sat beside Mama Grace, holding her hand, whispering prayers. "You see," Mama Grace said weakly to Ruth, "the child you cried for has become a pillar." Tears filled Ruth's eyes. Mama Grace recovered slowly, but the experience shook Ruth deeply. It reminded her how fragile life remained and how much she had already lost and gained. That night, Ruth could not sleep. She stepped outside and found Daniel sitting beneath the stars. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. Daniel waited. "For years," Ruth continued, "I survived by holding on to my child, holding on to dignity, holding on to breath." Daniel nodded. "But I don't want to live only by holding on anymore," she said. "I want to choose." Daniel's heart pounded. "Choose what?" Peace, Ruth replied. "Not the kind that pretends nothing happened. The kind that knows the truth and still rests." She turned to him. "I don't promise love," she said carefully. "And I don't promise tomorrow. But I can allow trust to grow slowly if you keep being who you are now." Daniel swallowed hard. "That's more than I deserve." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," Ruth replied. "This is about what builds life, not what repays debt." From that night, something shifted between them. Not romance, not certainty, but alignment. They moved together more naturally. Shared decisions, shared silence, shared responsibility. Miracle noticed. One afternoon, he asked Ruth directly, are you and Father. Together, Ruth smiled gently. We are a family, she answered. That is enough for now. Miracle nodded satisfied. Word spread quietly through the village Ruth had not returned to the past, but she had not rejected the future either. People respected her restraint, her strength, her refusal to rush healing. Daniel felt gratitude he could never fully express. The final scene of reckoning came not with confrontation, but with recognition. At the year-end school ceremony, Miracle stood on a small stage, his hands steady as he received an academic award. The applause was warm, genuine. Ruth clapped until her palms hurt. Daniel stood beside her, eyes shining. As Miracle stepped down, the head teacher spoke into the microphone. This boy, she said, is proof that where a child begins does not determine where he will go. The words landed softly, powerfully. On the walk home, Miracle turned to Daniel. Thank you, he said, for what Daniel asked, for not leaving again. Daniel stopped walking. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I will never leave, he said, even if you push me away one day. Even if you walk a road I don't understand. Miracle smiled. I won't. That night, Ruth lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of Umue, the insects, the distant laughter, the steady breathing of her son. For the first time in many years, her thoughts did not race toward fear or resentment. They rested. She understood then that justice had come not as revenge, not as public shame, but as transformation. The man who once walked away had learned to stay. The child who was once denied had become undeniable. And the woman who once stood alone on a dusty road had found her footing not in someone else's return, but in her own unbreakable strength. The past had finally loosened its grip. What remained was choice, and Ruth was ready to make it. The morning light in Umue felt different. It was not brighter than usual, nor softer, yet Ruth sensed the change the moment she stepped outside. The air carried no weight, no waiting, no fear crouching in the corners of her chest. For the first time since the day Daniel walked away years ago, nothing inside her was bracing for the next blow. Life had finally stopped feeling like survival. Miracle prepared for school with calm confidence. His movements were unhurried. His shoulders no longer carried the tension of a child who wondered if the ground beneath him might disappear. He packed his books, carefully checked his homework twice, and tied his shoes with practiced ease. Ruth watched him from the doorway. "You're early today," she said. Miracle smiled. "I like being ready." Daniel arrived moments later carrying a small sack of maize. He greeted Ruth with a nod, not ownership, not apology, just respect. "I'll drop this at the mill," he said. "Then I'll walk Miracle to school." Ruth nodded. Years ago, such a simple statement would have felt like a miracle. Now, it was simply normal. After they left, Ruth sat alone for a while, letting memory pass through her without resistance. She remembered the girl she'd been standing on the red road pregnant and shaking, begging a man not to abandon her. She did not judge that girl anymore. She honored her. That girl had survived so this woman could choose. The village, too, had changed its tone. Where whispers once followed Ruth greetings now did. Where judgment once lived, quiet respect took its place. People did not praise her loudly. They simply treated her differently. They saw a woman who had endured without turning bitter, who had raised a child without shame, who had stood firm when many would have broken. One afternoon, Ruth was called to the women's meeting at the community hall. She went without expectation. After discussions ended, an elder woman stood and gestured toward Ruth. "There are young girls here," the woman said, "who believe love means losing yourself. Ruth, speak to them." Ruth froze. She had never imagined herself as someone others would listen to. Slowly she stood. "I loved a man," once she began quietly. "I gave him everything I had. When he left, I thought my life was over. The room was silent, but I learned something," she continued. "Love that destroys your dignity is not love. And suffering does not make you weak. It teaches you what must never be repeated." Some women wiped their eyes. Ruth sat down, her heart steady. Her voice had not shaken. That evening, Daniel returned from the farm later than usual. His face carried a seriousness Ruth recognized. "I've been offered a job in the nearby town," he said. "Nothing big, but stable, close enough that I don't leave." Ruth studied him. "What do you want?" "I want to work," Daniel replied. "And come home." Home. The word did not frighten her. "That's good," she said simply. Miracle overheard and smiled without comment. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. Miracle continued to excel in school. His teachers spoke of scholarships of opportunities beyond Umuai. Ruth listened with hope, but not desperation. She knew now that her son's worth was not measured by escape, but by possibility. One night, Miracle asked a question that felt final in its gentleness. "Mother," he said, "do you regret anything?" Ruth considered carefully. "I regret the pain," she answered, "but not the path. It shaped us." Miracle nodded. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," she replied. Daniel listened quietly from the doorway, humbled beyond words. The final reckoning came not through confrontation, but through understanding. One evening, as the three of them sat outside watching the stars, Daniel spoke. "I used to think success meant running forward and never looking back," he said. "Now I know it means stopping when you must." Ruth did not respond immediately. "You didn't come back to save me," she said finally. "I saved myself." "You came back to learn." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Miracle leaned back against his mother. "And I came from both of you." Ruth smiled. In that moment, the past felt complete, not erased, not forgotten, but settled. The man who once denied his child had learned that responsibility does not end with apology, it begins there. The woman who was once abandoned had discovered that dignity is not given, it is claimed. And the child who was once a symbol of shame had become proof of grace. Years later, when people told this story in Umuai, they did not begin with the betrayal. They began with what followed. They spoke of a woman who refused to disappear, of a man who learned to stay, and of a boy who grew strong not because life was kind, but because truth finally was. Ruth often thought of the road where it all began. It was still there, still dusty, still ordinary. But she no longer saw it as the place she was left behind. She saw it as the place she stood and did not fall. This story reminds us that life does not always reward goodness immediately, but it never forgets it. Ruth did not survive because someone came back to save her. She survived because she chose dignity when bitterness would have been easier strength, when despair felt justified, and truth when silence seemed safer. Her journey shows that suffering does not define us, but how we respond to it does. Sometimes justice is not loud. It does not arrive as punishment or revenge. Sometimes justice is quiet growth, slow accountability, and the courage to face what we once ran from. Daniel's story is not about redemption through words, but through staying, through showing up when it is uncomfortable, through accepting consequences without demanding forgiveness. And Miracle's life reminds us that a child is never a mistake, even when born from broken choices. With love, truth, and consistency, what begins in pain can grow into purpose. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Where have you been holding on to anger that is only exhausting you? Where have you been waiting for justice to look like punishment instead of healing? And what would change if you chose truth today, even if it is uncomfortable? We would love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what part of this story moved you the most, and tell us where you are watching from. If stories of resilience, accountability, and hope speak to your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today.